Hello, global gardeners, and happy Monday. Let's talk gardening. That's why I'm here. I think that's probably why you're here. Today I'm planning to focus on tomatoes and cucumbers, but of course anything is open. Let me know your questions and we can have all the gardening conversation that we can over the course of the next 90 minutes. I want to start off with a huge shout out to Brian, who gifted 10 memberships to the Gardener Scott membership community. You're just so generous, Brian, and so fantastic to do that. The membership is a great option to get some extra perks that we have in that community, and Brian is just such a huge supporter and so helpful. I think giving the gift of gardening is one of the best things that a gardener can do. And I've said that many times before. You can give the gift of gardening in so many ways, and this is just one of the many ways that Brian does it on a regular basis. So you're an awesome man, Brian. Thank you so much for doing that. It's nice to have everybody here today. It's actually starting to look like summer in my garden. I saw the comments that Denver 1865 was making, and elevation makes a big difference in gardening. For most of you, you don't have to deal with high elevation. My garden is about 7,000 feet in elevation, and Denver 1865 is about that same height, maybe a little bit more than that. And this weekend, I took my own advice and decided to go tour some gardens. And there was an organization here in town that has an annual garden tour. I think there were 8 gardens on the tour this year. And I did that yesterday, walking through Colorado Springs, looking at all the different gardens. On Saturday, I did the same thing with a different group that has an annual tour of waterfalls and ponds. So I spent this whole weekend just looking at other people's gardens. And those gardens, in many cases, are almost 1,000 feet lower in elevation in the city. And they have plants growing. They have flowers that are blooming. They have gardens that look fantastic. And our gardens that are at a higher elevation are often a week or 2 or sometimes 3 weeks behind everybody else who's just a few miles away. So it was enjoyable to see all those wonderful plants and all those blooms. And now I come back to my garden and I'm just waiting. I do have some wonderful Chinese poppies that are in bloom right now. My irises are in bloom and my California poppies are in bloom. And so I'm enjoying that. A lot of the wild flowers that I have around the garden are starting to bloom. So this is just such a wonderful time of year after the crazy spring or lack of spring that we had in my garden. But I've got all my tomatoes in the ground now. I put my cucumber seeds in the ground, and it's about time for them to start growing and showing me the life that I'm expecting. And that's why I wanted to talk about those 2 plants in particular today, because those are among the most common plants that we grow in our vegetable gardens. And they're among the most common plants that I get questions about on a regular basis, like from Pam Propati. How do you keep the squirrels and critters from eating the tomatoes when they bloom? And so I had answered a similar question earlier today in comments on one of my videos. The best way to keep the critters away from your plants is a barrier, a fence. I think for a lot of the animals like squirrels, for instance, bird netting can be quite effective. In a lot of my videos, when I'm talking about the tomatoes, I'll show my tall trellis, the arch that I make from cattle panels. And it's about 6 feet tall. I keep my tomatoes growing inside that trellis for the most part. It is a great way for me to throw plastic over like I did this last week to help protect from hail, or to throw shade cloth over in the peak of summer. But you can also use a trellis like that, a hoop, or even just a ladder trellis of some type that you string bird netting over it. And that can actually be quite effective at keeping the squirrels and similar animals away from your plants. I also regularly, when this topic comes up, talk about giving the animals another option. Having a squirrel feeder in your garden can be very effective at keeping the squirrels away from the rest of your garden. I always bring up my brother-in-law and sister-in-law who have actually they have 2 squirrel feeders on their fence. And I think they primarily use peanuts, but they'll vary it from time to time. And so they always have their squirrel feeders filled with food for the squirrels. And they never have a problem with squirrels in the garden. Now, there's an expense associated with that, and got to make sure that you keep the feeder filled or the squirrels are going to go elsewhere. But why would they waste their time coming off the fence, going to the garden and eating your harvest and potentially encounter predators along the way when they can just stay in their nice sheltered fence and have the free food? So having a barrier and having other food options are the 2, I think, best approaches that you can take to deal with some of those animal issues, and it actually works pretty well. So consider that as an option if you haven't already started doing that. Hi, Bettina. Went on a mystery bus tour with the local horticultural society. Nice idea. It was a blast. A bit of shopping at various nurseries, lovely lunch and treats at a chocolate shop. I want to go. I want to sign up. It's so much fun to spend time with other gardeners and go to nurseries and do something like that. That's why I always encourage it. I actually ran into quite a few people I haven't seen in years. That's another reason to get out and about as often as you can. The tour I went on was sponsored by the local Master Gardener group, and I'm not as active with the Master Gardeners as I used to be. And so I was rubbing elbows with people, other gardeners, other Master Gardeners that I haven't seen in years in some cases. And so the socialization of gardeners is just so much fun. It's almost always enjoyable, and it really is something that I would encourage you to do. Plus, I got lots of good ideas. I took a lot of photos and got ideas of things I want to do in my own garden because I saw it in someone else's garden. I've been trying to put together ideas and lists of what I like and what I'm planning to do. And then when I discover something that I hadn't even thought about, that often goes to the top of the list or close to it. And there are some things like that I discovered in just walking in other people's gardens. So it's a fantastic thing to do if you get that opportunity. Shandy's Garden saying, here but exhausted. I really overdid it in the garden this weekend, so fatigued. But if you're going to be tired, that's a good way to get tired. So tired. Went the whole day with no food and barely any water. Everything's in the ground, but don't do like me. I will second that. Get out in the garden. It's okay to get tired, but you got to make sure you're drinking your water. You got to make sure that you're eating. You don't want to struggle and suffer the next day. So I'm glad you got out. I'm glad you got stuff done. But yes, please drink your water and eat your food when you're in the garden. I have that problem. I do, where I do the same thing. I go out for an hour and think I'll be coming back, and I leave my water bottle indoors because I'm not going to be out that long. And the next thing I know, I'm outside 2 or 3 hours without drinking the water that I should. And we're all guilty of it, but try to take care of yourself if at all possible. And from there, you won't be suffering as much in the day after or a few days beyond that. Gardens Happen saying window screening works as well. And so who was I talking to? I was just talking with, it was one of the gardeners that I was rubbing elbows with yesterday. I can't remember who it was. Not that you would know them, but I'm trying to remember who it was I was talking to. And what they did, very similar idea with some pests in their garden. They actually, and this is one of those new ideas, they actually got screening that was made for a garage. So imagine the size of garage doors, and there are companies that make screens specifically sized to fit over that opening in a garage door so that you could be in your garage and have the screen so that that insects aren't flying in. And they came across those big sheets of screen and are now using that screening in their garden. And it has been very effective at keeping, in this case, they were trying to keep the insect pests away. So they put that screening over hoops to keep the insects away, but it could easily work for keeping animal pests away. So yes, window screening is definitely something to use. I've used it in much smaller sizes in the past, but I really like the idea of finding a source for big sheets of window screening, and it can definitely be an option. Dwayne West is wondering, do you recommend thinning the sun leaves on tomatoes and cutting off all leaves below the fruit? I don't. So I do recommend pruning the tomato. Now it does depend on your climate and what weather patterns you're having. In my region, it's so dry in the summer and that sun is just baking. Because I'm closer to the sun is more intense. And so keeping the leaves around the fruit really can help prevent sun scald. Your fruit can get sunburned if it has too intense of the sunlight hitting it on, like you'll see the little whites, not little, they're usually big white spots that develop, and that's the sun scald. The fruit is being damaged by the sun. So keeping the leaves on below, above, and right next to the fruit, I think makes a difference, because if you try to target which leaves you're going to take off, with sun's moving across the sky, and you may still get some sun damage. The leaves below the fruit, if there's being exposed to the sun, they're still producing the energy for the plant through photosynthesis. As those lower leaves start to fade, if they turn yellow and they start falling off, I'll go ahead and prune off the nearby branches and leaves that haven't fallen off yet. And so I do try to keep the lower part of the plant free of the branches and leaves, but that's more of just a nice pattern to get into to keep your plant disease free, because a lot of the diseases will be in the soil or on the mulch, and then you water or it rains and the fungal spores will bounce up onto the plants, and the next thing you know, you have a fungal disease on your tomatoes. So I do recommend pruning off those lower branches, but not necessarily. And I've seen some gardeners do this. This might be where your question is coming from. On an indeterminate tomato plant, you'll have the fruit develop low on the plant. And then as the plant grows, you harvest that fruit, and then a new cluster appears above that, and then a new cluster appears above that. And as the plant grows, the fruit grows closer to the growing tip. Once you harvest all that fruit on the bottom part of the plant, there's not going to be another cluster that grows. And so you can just keep pruning all the way up the plant until you're left with a tree, a tomato tree, where all of those lower branches and leaves have been removed, and you're only supporting the top portion that is actively growing with fruit. Well, by the time the plant gets that big, it usually has a pretty robust root system, and those roots are needing a lot of nutrients from the soil, but they also need all of the energy from the sun. And so you could hinder some of that new growth. You could limit the development of the fruit by pruning off too much. And so I'll just prune off the lowest of those leaves and branches up to about 18 inches, half a meter. And then above that, I just let the plant grow, and as long as it's keeping healthy, I'm only pruning off the extra suckers that are getting a little unruly, and I'm letting the plant take care of itself, producing all the energy that it really needs for that developing fruit. So it's totally up to you. In fact, it's one of those things that I would suggest experiment a little with. Grow a couple different tomato plants and prune one a lot and prune another one a little, and see if you can tell the difference in the size of the fruit, in the amount of the fruit, and in the overall health of the plant. And that's how you develop your method of gardening for yourself. I'm here to help answer questions and offer some tips But my way is not necessarily the best way for you. You have to develop what's best for you. And one of the ways to do that is to experiment with things like pruning the tomatoes. And the reason I want to talk about tomatoes and cucumbers together today is because I think there's a lot of similarities in how the plants grow. Indeterminate tomato plants and vining cucumber plants are quite similar in the way that they'll have the suckers develop in the little crooks between the leaf branches and the stem. They're very similar in how you can trellis them. They're similar in how they flower and fruit, and you pick the fruit and it encourages more fruit. So there's a lot of similarities between the two plants. And a determinate tomato plant and a bush cucumber have a lot of similarities too. So because we grow them a lot, much of what I'm saying for a tomato is often also suitable for cucumbers as well. Isabel, thank you so much for that contribution. I have 2 cancers, but I keep it growing in my garden. It helps even if half my plants do not survive due to inconsistency. So thank you so much for that. But I'm not sure about what the 2 cancers are that you have. I hope everything is going well for you, but definitely keep getting out there in the garden and keep growing. And I agree with you. Even if I am losing half the plants, I'm still out in the garden. I actually had to replant some of my tomatoes that I had put in a month or so ago that just haven't done well because of this crazy weather. Sometimes it's okay to go ahead and pull a plant and start over again. There's other sections that I haven't planted because I don't think the season is going to be long enough. But getting out there, and I agree with you, keep growing even if half the garden doesn't make it. It's the other half that you can really use to benefit your energy and your mind and your heart. And that's why there's been some years where it seems like there's only one plant that does well in the garden, and that one plant doing well and giving harvest kind of makes the whole season worthwhile. So that's the way I approach it as well, is just getting out there and gardening and enjoying everything that I can. Moondust is saying, I would love a wisteria, but it's poisonous to pets. But a queen's wreath tree is similar, but not poisonous to pets. But I'm not sure how big they get. I haven't grown the queen's wreath, so I really couldn't say. Wisteria, of course, can get very, very, very big and tall and wide, and depending on the variety. But I really don't know how queen's wreath compares to that. So if you've got experience, anyone else out there with the queen's wreath, go ahead, throw it in the comments for Moondust, and we'll all learn something like that. Denver 1865 says, isn't gardening the best thing to share? I love it. Absolutely. It is about the best thing you can share. Hey, Tony, I see that Simplified Gardening has checked on. Hello to Yankee Sister Homestead. Always nice to have you here on Mondays as well. So nice to see all the regulars. It looks like Dusty Flats says, with rain, finally, I suppose the weeds will kick butt. Yes, if you have a portion of the rain that we've been getting for so long, you can expect the weeds to take over. I've been doing more time weeding in my garden this week than I think I have in, I can't remember how long it's been. It's been years since we've had this much rain, and the weeds are definitely taking over. Jeremy Ransom says, I ordered 10 pieces of 6x20, 40% shade cloth to put over the garden for our sunny July and hot August here in East County, San Diego. Good for you. I actually just put up some 40% shade cloth in my greenhouse. You'll be seeing that in an upcoming video. But I went ahead and pulled out my boxes of shade cloth for the other parts of my garden, because even though it took forever for my garden to get to a warm point, by July and August, I'm expecting to be extremely hot. So good for you, Jeremy. That's a good idea. If you know that you are going to have the hot weather that you always have in summer, prepare, plan ahead, order that shade cloth, put up the hoops, get everything ready to go so that when it hits, you're just going to treat it like another gardening day. You just go out, grab your shade cloth, put it on the hoops, and now your plants aren't going to suffer. So this is one of those preparatory items you can take care of a month or two in advance, and it can make a big difference when the time comes. Dan Galamidi, first time growing black crim and other heirlooms, saying new growth stem coming off a fruit cluster. Not a sucker. Is this just something some heirlooms do? Yeah, you can expect, it's not necessarily heirlooms because there might be some hybrids that grow the same way. But yeah, take a close look at what's happening. Often though, you'll see that the way, like, and black crim has really interesting growth in this respect as well. And you can see how the fruit clusters form on different tomato plants, because where they form and how often they form really will vary by the different tomato varieties. And so that's one thing. I talked about it in a video a few weeks back in my hydroponics system. I was able to see that my plants weren't getting enough light because I could see that the gap between the stems and the fruit clusters was longer than normal, longer than it would be if I was growing it outside. So that told me that the plants were getting leggy, and the reason for that is I didn't have strong enough lights in my grow area. So it's really a good idea to do what you're doing, Dan, is observe how the plants are growing to see how suckers grow. And this is one of those things that I'm starting to see right now because my tomatoes have struggled for so long. In the past, I would get the plants growing and the suckers would start appearing at those crooks between the leaf branch and the stem as the plant was growing. But because my tomato plants that I put in when the ground was still relatively cool, I wasn't seeing that. But now it's happening. It's just happening at a different pace than I'm used to. And so making note of how the plants grow when the temperatures are different, when the sunlight is different, and when the variety is different, I think is really fascinating, because there is no single way that tomato plants grow. They are different. I have one section where I'm growing my potato leaf tomatoes, and so even the leaves of the tomato plant will vary based on the variety. And so when you start seeing those kind of things, it can really grow your gardening knowledge, of course, but it really helps identify for you the amount of difference that we have, because there are just hundreds and hundreds of varieties you can choose from, and they all have something unique about them. StarBQ Podcast, hello, happy Monday. I have peas growing along the edge of my tomato bed. I've been trying to trim any tendrils that wrap around tomato branches. Are these going to strangle my tomatoes, or no big deal? It's no big deal. The tendril, while it will grab onto branches or leaves or whatever, the tomato trellis. I've grown peas alongside tomatoes up the trellis before, and they always escape the trellis and wrap around some of the tomato branches. It's not like it's a smothering grip and that it keeps getting tighter and tighter and tighter. Once it grabs onto the leaf, it essentially is done with its job, and now the rest of the plant will keep growing and new tendrils will arrive. And so it's possible that it might cut off some of the nutrients on a leaf, but it's not going to strangle the plant or really cause any excess damage. And if it looks like it's growing in an area that you don't want it to be, if you catch it early, you can unwrap the tendril and move it to another section, or just cut off the tendril and tie up the plant in a different area as well. But I think it's no big deal. I've had beans and peas grow up into my tomato plants and never even taken that much effort to deal with the tendrils, and everything is fine. And usually peas and beans, those vining plants, you're going to be harvesting them soon enough that the tomato plant is going to be growing and big long after those smaller plants have caused any of the stress that you might be going right now. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about it at all. Shandy's Garden says, I removed suckers from beefsteak tomato plants, or at least half of them, because I wasn't sure. Do you prune beefsteaks like that? And so assuming it's a beefsteak that is an indeterminate plant, then yeah, I do. I will prune off some of the suckers. I'll leave some of the suckers. It often is really based on how big my trellis is and how fast the plant is growing as to how much I prune. Uh, I'm basically a lazy gardener, and there's a ton of jobs to be done in the garden, and I prioritize. And pruning off suckers is one of those things that often falls lower in the priority list. And so, yeah, I'll pick a day and I'll go out and I'll prune off suckers that need to be pruned off. But for the most part, if the trellis is big enough, I let most of the suckers go ahead and grow because they'll produce more fruit. You get a bigger harvest with more of the suckers. I rarely remove all of the suckers. I'll allow at least 2 or 3 to develop on almost every plant. It's really a question for me is whether I've got 4 suckers that I leave or 12 suckers that I leave. But it's totally up to you, and it's totally up to the size that you want your plant to be, and that holds true for whether it's a beefsteak or whether it's a cherry tomato. Now, with beefsteaks in particular, if you have fewer of the suckers, that means the fruit that's left behind is not, there is not as much of it. And so you'll tend to get bigger beefsteak tomatoes if you prune off more of those suckers. And so it's a trade-off between a lot of fruit that's a little bit smaller or less fruit that's a little bit bigger. And there are many times, depending on the variety, you might not even be able to notice much of a size difference when you're talking the difference in quantity. And then there are some tomatoes that there is a noticeable difference in the size if you allow all those suckers to develop. So yet again, another reason to become familiar with the plants that you're growing so that you can figure out which way you like to go, more pruning or less pruning. Jay's wondering, any tricks to get my direct sown cucumber to germinate? They are more stubborn than I am. You know, that's a great question. So much of it is the soil temperature. And I'm in the same boat. I sowed some cucumber seeds this last week, and they're not germinating yet. But I know that my soil temperature is still pretty cool. At the beginning of this last week, just before the first day of summer, my soil temperature was not yet 60 degrees Fahrenheit, about 15 Celsius. And that to me is a cutoff. Your soil needs to be at least that much to even put your plants in the garden. And so we've had some warm days over the course of the last week. I haven't measured my temperature in a couple days. It's now a little bit higher than that. But I have no doubt that's why my cucumber seeds are taking much longer to germinate than they have in years past, because my soil temperature is so much cooler than it's been in years past. So I would say that is one and probably the most likely reason. And so what you can do is heat up the soil. Put plastic over that bed during the day so that the temperature inside the hoop and plastic, or put a cloche in place, or put something to help generate more heat in the soil, and you should see a little faster germination. So don't worry about being stubborn. It's just one of those things that we don't often think about, the importance of temperature in germination outside. We get into the calendar mode where it's time to put our seeds in and we expect everything to be good. But if the year is different, like some of us are having, it can make a big difference as to how quickly they germinate. So I actually have 2 beds, one with pickling cucumbers and one with the slicers, that I put the seeds in. I think it was on Wednesday this last week. And in years past, they were germinating in 4 or 5 days. And so it's almost a week now, and I'm not seeing anything pop up. But I'm trying to have patience and letting the weather warm up. And I actually had an issue with my zucchini. I put some zucchini seeds in a couple weeks ago, nothing. And so this last week, I put some more zucchini seeds in as well. It might all pop up at the same time, and I might have to do some thinning out, but I'm pretty sure, at least in my area, and probably for you as well, that it's the temperature. Formulus, hello. I've never had good luck with cucumbers, so I started them late I'm just going to hope for the best. I don't know if it's a water or pest thing, but if I need to grow vertically due to a fungus or bacteria. I grow my cucumbers vertically. Years and years ago, I had a garden and I had some issues. I'm not sure what it was. It was before I really understood much about diseases of plants. And it wasn't a good year for my cucumbers. Well, since then, and since I've learned more, I'm always growing my cucumbers vertically, except for a bush cucumber that doesn't vine and need to hold on to something with its tendrils. So keep doing. Don't worry about starting late. Like I said, mine aren't even out of the ground yet, and I still am hopeful for a harvest this season. And so I hope this year works better for you. Air circulation. This is one of those things with the cucumbers, like I was talking about with the tomatoes. Pruning off those lower branches and leaves as the plant grows will help increase air circulation and help decrease the possibility of disease if you're growing it up a trellis. So grow it up a trellis. Once the plant's big enough, start cutting off some of those lower branches so you reduce that likelihood of a problem. And hopefully this year you'll have more success with your cucumbers. We're all rooting for you. Tennessee Nana, when pruning my tomatoes the other week, I saw a sucker with flowers on it. So quickly put it in the tote next to my tomato tote. It's growing beautifully. So yeah, if you are pruning off a tomato, it doesn't work the same with cucumbers in this case. But because tomatoes will root all the way along the stem, if you have a sucker and you prune it off, you can put it into a glass of water and roots will start developing. Or you can put it directly into the ground and keep that soil moist and roots will start to grow and you'll get a whole new plant on it. And if it's got, this is one of those things, I think this might be what you're talking about, is if you do it early enough and before the flowers have fully developed, you can actually have just a little mini tomato plant and those flowers will probably pollinate themselves and you might actually get some fruit growth as that little sucker is starting to grow in the ground. So that's a fun experiment. It's probably not going to grow much bigger because all the energy of that plant is going into those flowers and fruit immediately. But that's a good way. You can clone your plants by just cutting off the suckers and allowing them to root where you want a new plant to be. And before you know it, you've got the same lovely plant in a different area of your garden. I did that last year with a few different plants and the clones really did well. Now they're starting behind the plant that's established in the ground, but depending on the length of your growing season, you can probably expect to get some harvest in those suckers that you put into a different area of the garden as you expand it. Brian says, do you get much leaf curl on your black creme? Even with 60-40 shade cloth, I still get curl. It depends. Last year, I actually had a problem with leaf curl for the first time in a few years. I was trying to figure out what was different last year because I did have leaf curl on my black creme. One of the reasons I like black creme is because it can handle cool conditions. It can handle a lot of what is happening in my garden. But last year we had a particularly dry and windy August, and actually end of July into August. And that's why I think my tomatoes were curling, or the leaves were curling, because it was just so windy and it was a dry wind. And that is one of the things that can cause leaf curl. Leaf curl is often environmental. It's often caused by the weather. And I have had that problem. So my plants are still too small right now to be seeing anything. And they're actually doing pretty well because the soil is nice and moist for them. But yes, I have had that in the past. Not often, because the black creme is such a sturdy, hardy plant, and it just shakes off most of the problems that other plants will have. So take a look at what's happening, the weather conditions, and if you think you can attribute the leaf curl to one of those, then you might be able to cover the plants or put up a wind block or something else, or increase the watering or decrease the watering, because the water issue can also cause leaf curl as well, though I haven't seen that as much in the black creme. So hey, growing roots in agriculture is in Mexico on vacation and still participating in the Monday live stream. So nice that you're here today. Thanks for that, Emmanuel. Hope you're having a great time in Mexico. That's fantastic. Moondust is wondering, what are the best heirloom tomatoes to grow? I can't give you a single answer. I can tell you, and I did a video about this not long ago, that when I choose my heirloom varieties, there are a few different things that I'm looking for. And so one of them is taste. And so choose an heirloom tomato that matches what you like to eat in a tomato as far as the flavor. I grow a lot of cherry tomatoes that are heirlooms because they do best in my area because of my shorter growing season. And I like to grow tomatoes that are hardy, that can handle my severe weather conditions. So for me, I grow black creme. It's a Russian tomato that can handle the conditions that I have with my weather, like I was just talking about. I grow sun gold because it's a delicious cherry tomato that does extremely well in my area. I grow sweet 100 or sweet million for the same reason. The sun gold is a yellow orange color, and the sweet 100 and sweet million is a red color. That's another reason to choose the variety, is the color. Do you prefer one color over the other? And so it's usually a good idea to look at, or to start taking accounting of what you want to see in a tomato plant that you're growing, how long it takes to harvest. The heirloom tomato plants that I'm growing are all going to be giving me a harvest between 70 and 80 days. That's my target. You can have some wonderful heirloom tomatoes out there that are big beefsteak tomatoes that might take 100 to 110 days to harvest. I can't do that in my short season. So look at all those different factors, because if you've got a long growing season and you like a big beefsteak tomato, then something like Mortgage Lifter has just been around for almost 100 years now and is a favorite of many tomato growers. That's a great heirloom. If you have a region like mine where it's a little more challenging, black creme is my favorite, and that's the one I like to do. So figure out what you want, and then you can do a search and ask questions about the same type of tomato that others might be growing in your area. And this is another good reason to rub elbows with other gardeners and go on garden tours in your area to see what other gardeners are growing in your area, because chances are the experienced gardeners that have been growing tomatoes for years and years are growing the plants that do best. And I find in my area there are often the plant Celebrity is one of those tomatoes that you can find in all the garden centers and all the nurseries, and it does pretty well in my garden. And most of the gardeners in my garden club are growing Celebrity. Now that's one that happens to fit into my region, and just because of its availability, I think that's why people are growing it. But look for that kind of thing for recommendations as you move forward, because what others are doing and have had success with near you will probably do well in your garden as well. Raphael Boo Boo says, something bit off the very top of my sunflower seedling. Will it grow another branch, or is it kaput? Depends on the sunflower. There are some sunflowers. I've had a few varieties in recent years that aren't the single stalk with the single head at the top. They're more of a bush sunflower, and they do have the branches coming out all along the stem. So if it's one of those kind of sunflowers where it has multiple branches with multiple flowers, then losing that growing tip may not be catastrophic. But if it is one of those sunflowers that is like a mammoth sunflower that's going to grow 12 feet tall with a single flower at the top, and that tip has been chewed off, it's probably not going to recover. I would say it's kaput, and you probably might still have some time to put in some more seeds and give it another try. Put a barrier around it if you can figure out what it was that ate it, and hopefully the next time you'll or later in this season you'll have plants and flowers, and you'll have figured out what the problem was that led to this one. Garden in the Woods is asking, what would be the best to put over my compost, weed fleece or tarp? I have these, so wondering if one is better than the other. And so this is another one of those that it's weather dependent. And so I'll often recommend that if you live in a really rainy environment, that you do a tarp or a plastic sheet to avoid your compost pile getting too wet, because you want the moisture balance to be about right. And there's a lot of this in Tony's book about composting, where you can focus on a very specific moisture level in your compost and you'll get better results. If it gets too wet, then the pile will shut down. The bacteria, particularly the thermophilic bacteria that generates all that heat, it's just too wet for them, and it can actually kill the bacteria. So in really wet regions, a tarp, something that keeps the rain off so that you can control the moisture level, is usually a good idea. You can also make the argument for using a tarp if you live in a really wet region, because instead of all the moisture in your pile evaporating into the air, the tarp or the plastic cover is helping to hold in some of that moisture. So you have to get out there on a regular basis and cover or uncover to figure out what the moisture level is at, and you have to take an active role in your compost pile. The other option, and I think a lazier approach, and I've done this as well, is to use a weed barrier. Often they allow water to flow through them, but they're a barrier that's enough to help reduce some of that evaporation. And so if you're in a dry area with occasional rain, then you might want to put something like the weed fleece or a weed barrier that allows water in, so that it's helping with the evaporation. But when it rains, some of that rain is actually making it into the pile. So there's no single answer. A lot of it depends on how much work you want to do by maintaining the moisture level, and just what's happening with your weather patterns as to whether there's rain or no rain, or whether it's a low humidity. All those become a factor when you're trying to decide what to do. Shandy's Garden is saying, good question about the compost. I think we want the water, so I was thinking of just a shade cloth or just some cardboard sheets so it doesn't all get baked. And that's one of those things when I'm asked about where to put a compost pile, shade becomes a factor. And so a compost pile underneath or near trees that can shade the pile can also do the same thing, help moderate that soil moisture and keep the pile from being baked in the sun and all the moisture evaporating. And yeah, if it's out in the open, shade cloth can accomplish the same thing. The moisture level is much more important in composting than I think a lot of gardeners recognize, which is why I point out Tony really does have some good information in his book where he breaks all that down and can tell you how the pile will react differently based on what the moisture level is in the pile. And so what you can do to keep it under control, your control, really will make a difference. And you'll probably see success if you do take that time. Bud Jenkins, hello to you on this Monday. I admit that I've had hit or miss success transplanting my lemon cucumber seedlings. Do you direct seed only with cucumbers? I try to get a head start, but, don't feel bad, Bud. Lemon cucumbers, I have been hit and miss. That's one of those that I just don't grow anymore because it's so hit and miss. I've had mostly bad years, occasionally an okay year, and I'm always starting from seed. I a number of years ago did buy some plants from one of the garden centers. Didn't notice any difference with my lemon cucumbers. For some reason, they just don't like my garden, or they don't like me trying to grow them. And so I do all my cucumbers and squashes and melons from seed. I haven't noticed in my garden that big a difference if I start the seed and then transplant. You're going to have transplant shock, and usually you'll need to transplant within the first 3 weeks, or the plant gets too big to transplant. And so what I've found in relatively scientific but not scientific studies that I've done is if I start a seed like cucumbers in a pot and then transplant it, and right next to it I start from seed, halfway through the season you can't tell any difference between the two plants. And so it's just easier to just start everything from seed and not have to worry about the transplanting process. So yeah, it's a nice idea to try to get a head start, but for assuming they can germinate, keep your fingers crossed I get germination this week. Assuming all the plants are germinating, they're going to grow so quickly that I don't really think it is that much of a head start. I did it last year with my butternut squash, and at the end of the season, the plants that I had started early, I harvested about 3 days earlier than the rest of the plants. They did flower a little bit early, just by a few days, and I harvested a little bit early, but just by a few days. So in a really short growing season, yes, it can make a difference. If 3 to 4 to 5 days makes a difference in whether you get a harvest or not, then you might want to get that head start. But for me, in my garden, that extra amount of work isn't worth the handful of days at the end of the season. So that's the approach I take. Lily's asking, why are my bush Goliath tomatoes smaller than golf balls? Should I remove some tomatoes? So I can't speak exactly why they're so small, but it could be the temperature of the soil, it could be the nutrients, it could be the amount of water, it could be the amount of light that the plants are getting, and it could be the quantity of the fruit. If there's a whole bunch of flowers and a whole bunch of fruit developing, then you're going to have smaller tomatoes than you might expect. And so you'll see this on a lot of fruit trees, for instance. Prune off some of those flowers, prune off some of that small fruit early on, and then the energy from the plant will go to the remaining fruit, and you'll get bigger fruit, should get bigger fruit. So yeah, I would try that, Lily. Go ahead and remove some of the tomatoes and see if maybe the remaining fruit ends up getting bigger as a result of that. Okay, let's see. I know I'm falling behind, so I'm going to try to catch up a little bit as I scroll down. Laura asks us saying, I have a volunteer tomato growing where I started a compost pile last year, and it's pretty big. Do you think I can transplant it? It's behind a shed I'm tearing down. So the bigger a plant gets, the more difficult it is to have successful transplanting, because all the roots that are in the ground are supporting that big plant. And when you dig it up, you're going to damage roots. You're going to severely hamper the energy that that plant is getting. And then when you transplant it, the whole plant's going to suffer. So a trick that a lot of gardeners will use is to dig up a plant, even if it is a big one, but prune it back, cut back a lot of the side branches, cut back as much of the growth as you can, so that when you transplant it, the roots that are remaining are enough to keep the plant alive and keep the plant growing. So yes, you can always transplant. It's just a question of how successful the transplant will be. If it's happy in that spot and you can leave it there, that's usually the approach I take. I will often let volunteers grow where they're growing because they obviously like that spot and they're doing well in that spot. So keep them in that spot. And so totally up to you. If it's one of those things that you can't do the compost, or the compost pile is interfering with the plant, then yeah, go ahead and transplant it, because you're not going to lose anything. If the plant's going to suffer and die where it's at, take the risk. Go ahead and experiment a little bit with it and go ahead and transplant it over into that new area. and you might surprise yourself at how well it can end up growing for you. Sunset Gazing says, I did have a question on why cucumbers were not forming, but I checked this morning and have about 4 forming the size of a marble. Hand pollinated some and bees finally found them. There you go. It's all about the patience. Sometimes we think we're doing something wrong, and it is just something as simple as the amount of sun that it's getting and the temperature of the soil and the moisture level. Sometimes if any of those are off by just a little bit, it really can affect how the plant is growing and how the flowers are starting to appear. But it's one of those things that if you wait a day or two, everything might be solved. Deborah Jones is wondering, only seeing male flowers on pumpkins and squash. Anything I can do, should do, please? Yes, have patience. This is another one of those patience things. Almost all squashes are going to produce male flowers first. And it could be for a period of weeks. And then the female flowers will begin to appear. This is the way that the plant kind of ensures the propagation. If the female flowers appeared first and there were no male flowers to pollinate them, then they put all that energy into developing the embryo of that female flower, and then it just falls off the plant. So instead, what the plant does is it produces all the male flowers. So as soon as that first female appears, there might be 4 or 5 male flowers that are already there for the pollinators to do their job and ensure that that female flower is pollinated. So it's a natural timing event. And it's perfectly normal, and it could take a few days, it could take a few weeks. A lot of it depends on those factors, the sun and the water and the wind and the soil temperature. All of those are factors in determining when the female flowers appear. But yeah, just have some patience, Deborah. You should see the female flowers appearing before you know it. And as long as those male flowers are there, don't cut off those male flowers, because they've got a job to do. And once their job is done, they'll just fall off on their own. So you really don't need to worry too much about it. Bud saying, I agree on the Sweet Million. That's a must-grow sweet cherry for me every year. Very productive and delicious. Yeah, it is like a million fruits on a plant like that, and I absolutely love the taste of them as well. So when you can get a whole bunch of cherry tomatoes and they taste good, what's better than that? Okay, let's see. Andrea saying, do you ever make your own salsa? Oh, yeah. I've loved all your recipe videos and would love to see you make salsa if you do, in fact, make your own. Yeah, in fact, I had actually planned a video, but had some issues with the footage because I grew a salsa garden last year. And so in that video from last year where I grew a salsa garden, I talk about making salsa, and I talk a little bit about the recipe I use. Very, very simple. And I had a specific bed last year. You can see it in that salsa garden video. And in that bed, I had grown garlic and kept it in the ground till the end of the year, and then harvested it as part of the salsa making. I also have had cilantro in that bed. Enough of that seed actually fell on the ground that in that same bed this year, I've still got cilantro growing. And of course, I had jalapeno peppers and I had tomatoes that were growing in that bed. So in one bed, that was my salsa recipe. It was tomatoes and onions and garlic and cilantro. And I could go out and harvest and take it into the kitchen and make my own salsa. So yeah, that's a big reason why I grow tomatoes and garlic, is to make my own salsa. So because that video didn't work out, I'm thinking of this year when I can actually start harvesting, rather than making a full video of doing a short video, and I'll show you my recipe. And a lime juice and or vinegar is what I'll throw in as well. I don't like it super chunky, but I also don't like it super runny. So I do like a pico de gallo salsa, so everything is still relatively chunky, but definitely fresh from the garden. So yeah, thanks for asking that question, and thank you for that encouragement. I'll try to get a video out sometime this year if I can make it happen. Hello, Two Gals with Gail. I have lots of volunteer tomatoes and they make me laugh. The chipmunks really like the Aunt Molly's ground cherries. They carried them everywhere and they are really healthy. That's good. As long as you're okay with your squirrels carrying away the ground cherries, that's wonderful. I think it's always nice when you can be happy in the garden, even if it is one of those things that the squirrels are getting to. And so both Tea in the Garden's wondering how I feel about soil moist products. I'm not familiar with soil moist products, so I haven't used any. I don't recognize that brand name, and it's not something that I have seen in my local stores. So I'm not sure about that. I can't give you an opinion because it's something I'm not familiar with. CJ Don is wondering about the weather that's been so different than usual. Yep. Dry, hot, overcast. After a sunny day, my parsley and ground cherry have white blotches on the leaves. Sunburn? Yes, probably. Wow. And I saw that on some of my basil that I had put in. We had, I think, about 4, maybe 5 days of overcast conditions, and then suddenly the next day there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and I saw the same white blotches, and that's often the sun damage, because those plants are just used to cool conditions with no sun, and then suddenly it's like the rest of us. That first day of summer, you go out to the beach and you get sunburned. It's the same kind of thing that happens with the plants. So very likely that that's what it is. That white. You know, for us, it's our skin turns red, but for leaves and on the fruit, it's typically the white color that you'll see. For Tuloco 16, I transplanted some tomatoes into some clay soil. It rained for a week straight after I planted them. They're wilting and growing roots 4 to 5 inches up the stem. Are they doomed? No, not at all. In fact, that's a great observation. I love seeing the roots develop up the stem. That's telling you that it is a very wet environment for those tomato plants. So if it looks like the conditions are going to improve and it's not going to be so rainy and the soil is going to dry out a little bit, then this is another one of those, have patience. The plant's going to recover. It's wilting because it's drowning. And the upper roots are actually helping because they're helping to introduce some oxygen into the plant that might not be getting from the soil. You can also mound a potting soil mix around that stem that has roots on it, and roots will grow from there. And so you can take, especially if you're growing in clay soil that is staying wet, if you mound a better draining soil, like a potting mix, up around the stem, roots will grow into that, and it will drain a little bit better and still help support the plant. So that is a consideration. And like we were talking about earlier with cloning the plant, at some point, rather than trying to dig up and transplant a big plant, like I was talking about the root stress and the plant may suffer too much, go ahead and cut off the top portion of the plant, or cut off some suckers and root those and grow a whole new plant. It's got a head start with the leaves and the initial growth. It just needs to develop some roots, and that may be a way to have the same plant give you a successful harvest by just taking portions of those plants and putting them into an area that's not waterlogged clay. And even a pot, take a pot, put some potting mix into it, and cut off some of your tomato plant and stick it into that pot, and you can expect a plant is going to grow from it. So always fun to experiment with those kind of things, especially when it works out. And you might surprise yourself at how often something like that will work out. So, okay, let's see. I'm scrolling down, trying to catch up. I always love talking about these kind of things. While I'm thinking about it, let me point out the background. This photo comes from Betty Barnes, and you might look at this and say, well, that's a nice looking garden. Look at all those wonderful beds and all the pots and all the plants growing. But what's so interesting about this garden in particular is this isn't all Betty's garden. This is actually the backside of their apartment building, and it's like a little community garden in the backyard. So all of these beds belong to different tenants in the apartment complex. And the one that is just over my shoulder here, I think it's this one with all the pots, is the section that Betty has. So you can see it's a nice raised bed. It's got some pots growing around it, got some hoops that are there to set up if she needs to do the hoops. And so it's just one section of this larger area. And I love that idea. We often think about community gardens as being in a city park, or maybe there's a plot somewhere outside the city that everybody drives through to, or drives to do their gardening. But especially if you live in an apartment building and you can put together a group of fellow gardeners and you've got a little backyard space, why not start your own community garden in your own backyard? That's a fantastic idea. I actually haven't heard of anything like this before. All the community gardens I know might be in a neighborhood that everybody goes to do their gardening. But to actually have a community garden in your own backyard, fantastic idea. Fantastic idea. And all the plants, you can see that it's still early in the season and there's still lots of growth to come. But this is an interesting picture too, because you can see what the different gardeners are doing. So like I said at the beginning of the show, get out there and see other gardens. Community gardens can be a great opportunity because you can see different beds side by side, and the gardeners are doing different gardening methods. They've got different trellises. They're growing different plants. They've got beds that are made out of different materials. And so thank you for sharing this, Betty, because I really enjoy seeing the garden, of course. But you can also see, in the background, it's a parking lot with a bunch of stores. Doesn't matter where you do it. Get your gardening fix taken care of. And if you need to have a couple other people help you out with that, go for it. And the plants, when you harvest, they don't care where they're growing. They don't care whether they're in a community garden or not. Just grow your plants and have fun. So thanks for sharing this, because I really did appreciate the idea of you sharing a garden when only one of the beds is yours. And all the rest are actually looking really well too. So interesting idea. It's one of those kind of things that we may want a big garden, but we can't have a big garden. But we like being in a big garden. Well, a community garden might be the solution for something like that. So add that to your bag of tricks. Quiet Space Arts is wondering, any more videos of you and Eli and Kate? My fave 3 gardeners get together reaching across the big pond. Well, thank you for that. They always are joyous and fun. Great for cheering me up, Gardener Scott. So yes, actually we do. We were just conferring this week about what our next video is going to be. We have the current series that we're doing right now where we're growing the same varieties of tomatoes and comparing how they do in Scotland versus Colorado, and a greenhouse versus growing outdoors. And so the next video, we're not sure when it's coming out, but for me right now, my greenhouse tomatoes are actually doing better than my outdoor tomatoes because the outside conditions have been so bizarre this year. And Eli's outdoor tomatoes are actually, she might even be harvesting some fruit this week because they're doing so well. And so we weren't sure how that was going to work because we're each going outside of our comfort zone, but it's working quite well for both of us. And that's what the next video is going to be about. So my guess is probably sometime in July, we'll have the next video. And then a little bit later in the season, we'll have at least one more video where we'll be harvesting and showing the results of what we did. And then we'll probably do a late end of season planning video where we'll talk about all the lessons we learned and what we're going to do to put that information into next year's garden. So I'm guessing there's at least 3 more videos of us, and so that'll give you some opportunity for seeing more of your 3 favorite gardeners. So thank you so much for that. Okay, let's see. So much activity today. Always nice to see everybody here. Love how everyone is helping each other out with questions and answers and all the rest of it. Greg's saying, turning one side of my front yard into a native Nebraska prairie with perennial grasses and wildflowers. Have you thought about a native Colorado garden? Yeah, check it out. Go look at a video I did, I think it's 3 years old now, where I took out my front yard. I totally removed all of the lawn. I did some sculpting with heavy machinery. I put in some retaining walls, and I talk about that in that video about choosing the native plants. I have a number of native plants. Now, it's not all Colorado plants. And so when you think about native plants, you can often find plants that will match your climate, and they'll match your soil, they'll match your gardening conditions that come from another region of the world. And so while they might not be native to your area, they can be consistent with the plants you grow in the area. So like earlier I mentioned my Chinese poppies are flowering right now. That's one of those plants that I put into my front landscape. It's not a Colorado native, but the conditions that plant grows in naturally are almost identical to the conditions that I have. And I wanted big, bright red flowers that I can't get on a Colorado native plant. And so I've opted to go beyond Colorado. But I do have a couple sections in my backyard as well that I am focusing on Colorado natives in particular. There's an organization here in Colorado, Plant Select, and they actually are selling seeds and plants all around the United States, but they are focused here in Colorado. And so that's something I'm working on right now for a future video, is my Plant Select beds, where all of the plants in those beds are native to Colorado. So, oh yes, absolutely. That's definitely something that I am doing and am planning on doing more of. And congratulations to you for doing a Nebraska prairie. The grasses that I am growing in my garden, almost all of my grasses are Colorado natives. And many of the wildflowers are also Colorado natives. So absolutely. And I'll be talking more about that in future videos as those gardens get more established. You know, I don't think it makes for a great video to just show bare ground and say what this is going to be. I like to at least have some pictures to say, here's what it looks like now, and 2 years ago, this is how I started. So I have some footage that I've been taking over the course of the last couple of years to actually get to that point when I do start making those videos. So great idea. I think native gardens are really a wonderful way to do some of the gardening that we should be doing. And it matches. I'm also this year doing something a little bit differently. I'm letting more and more of my native volunteers. I've got plants that are flowering right now, and I'm not even sure what kind of plants they are, but they are plants that are native to my landscape. I scraped a bunch of them down to start my initial garden planning and construction, and now many of them have started growing again. I'm letting them grow. In the last couple of years, I've done a lot of weeding to keep my paths clear of those native plants. Then now that I'm letting them grow, especially with all this rain, they're beautiful flowers, and the bees love them, and it's attracting other pollinators. So the native insects you have often match up with the native plants you have, and if you can get a good balance of both of those, I think it really helps out your garden. So that's definitely something I encourage all of you to consider. Grow more of what wants to grow in your area, and you may find find out that you've got better success than when you try to grow something that really wasn't meant to grow in your area. So Colorblind Gardener says, I really enjoyed the shorts with Eli and Kate. It's on par with your April Fool's Day videos. Thank you for that. Yeah, I've been trying to figure out what other shorts we can be making. We're focused more on the garden stuff, but you can expect some more of those shorts to come in the days ahead as well. So thank you for that feedback. I definitely approach it. I like to make videos to help you. Absolutely. That's a big reason why I do it. But I also like to make videos to have fun and to make new friends. And so that's one of the reasons that I like doing the videos with Eli and Kate, because they are fun and they're informative, and they really have become some good friends in the time that we started putting all of our brain waves on the same path when it comes to gardening. Bud saying, I have a topic suggestion, gardening clubs. How to connect with one or start one in your area. Great idea, Bud. I've been trying to figure out how to do a video like that. I've mentioned it in the past, and I talk about doing my garden club meetings on a monthly basis. And we had our plant sale last month in lieu of our normal meeting. And I took a lot of footage at that plant sale because I do want to do a video about garden clubs. And I spoke at a garden club earlier this year, and I took a lot of photos from that when I was actually at that. So I've just been trying to figure out how to put together the story of garden clubs. So this has been on my mind for a long time, and I've been developing the basic concept and the photos and the footage. So thank you for that suggestion. I completely agree with you. I actually gave a talk at the Colorado Association of Garden Clubs. And that's what really got me thinking about it, because they actually have a website where you can go to that organization and they can link you to different garden clubs in different cities. But it's not an all-inclusive list. And so I'm not aware of similar organizations, but I think I'll make note of this, Bud, and I'll start doing a little bit of research, and maybe that approach might be a good one to take, is to find some of those organizations that will link you to local garden clubs, because it is a good idea. It is something I think can really help you connect with a gardener in your own area. And like Nick from Unum says, I wish I could meet people near me to exchange seedlings with. So absolutely, I'll try to figure out that story. Last year I had it programmed for a January, February video, because that's about the time of year that in my garden club we see new people coming in. And so right now that's kind of what I have it programmed for, is the January, February timeframe of next year. But if I can figure out a better storyline, maybe I'll accelerate it, and you might actually see it happening sooner than that. Hi, Mags. I love the videos and shorts with Eli and Kate too. They make me laugh so much and also informative. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's good feedback. It's always nice to know that we're appreciated. They're fun to do, but as you might guess, they take a lot of work, a lot of effort, and a lot of planning so that we can make sure everything is matching the way we want it to match. So it's always nice when they're well received. And so Tuloco 16 says, I believe persistent dandelions indicate a phosphorus deficient soil. Yeah, that's a good point. Most of the weeds we see that are growing in our garden, and many of them are native plants as well, will indicate a deficiency of nutrients. And so there are a few things that dandelions will identify, and I think phosphorus is just one of them. The way that nature works is there are seeds and spores all around us, and they'll germinate in soil that is best for that plant. Well, a lot of the weeds that we see are the type of plants that will grow in a soil that is deficient in particular nutrients. And so as soil builds over time, you have those initial they're called pioneer plants. You have those plants that are like the pioneers. They're the first ones to grow in soil. And as they grow and then die, they're adding nutrients to the soil. And then another crop of weeds will blow in, and you have another second generation of plants that start growing. And some of them are also weeds that will grow in a different type of nutrient deficiency. And they'll grow and they'll die and they'll enrich the soil. And now that the soil has been enriched by these previous generations, then plants will start to appear, the grasses and the bushes and then the trees, because the soil has been enriched over time. Now, this isn't something that happens overnight. It does take a lot of time to develop, but that's how nature works. And yes, absolutely, you can learn what your soil is deficient in by noting the plants that are growing naturally and that are growing well naturally, that you don't have to do anything for. And so add that to your list of things. When you see a weed, don't necessarily just think it's a weed that needs to be pulled. Learn about that plant. I did a video a couple years ago now, I think, where I talked about dandelions specifically and why I let my dandelions grow, because they are benefiting my soil because of how they grow. And I've got a video coming up, I think it might be on Saturday, maybe next week, where I'm using dandelions as an example of how you can make your own fertilizer in the garden by digging up some of these weeds and then soaking them in water and using that extract as a fertilizer, because that's what those weeds are doing. Is they're growing in a nutrient deficient environment, but they're bringing up some of those nutrients that the other plants need. And so if you use those type of plants as an ingredient in a fertilizer, you're now transferring all of those nutrients back into the soil for the other plants to use. So weeds are a whole another area that you can learn about for your gardening information and education. And I don't know all of what my weeds are. I often have to look them up if I'm that interested in it. So it will take some research, but there are enough sources out there that you can do a search, and there are phone apps that you can take a picture, identify what it is, learn about it, and your plants are doing this soil analysis for you. How cool is that? You just have to learn about the plants and what the analysis actually is and save yourself some effort. So always fun to do those kind of things. So Karen's saying, I've had to replant cucumbers and okra. Seems this cooler temperature is really messing me up. Yeah, like I've said earlier in the show, it's messing a lot of us up. It's definitely messing me up. And this gets back to that patience, redoing. Why are you gardening in the first place? If you're gardening to just get outside and grow some plants, and it's not that important that you have a huge harvest, then go ahead and start seeds and grow those plants, and you may or may not get a harvest. That's kind of my approach this year. Is I'm going to be very happy for whatever harvest I get, because everything has been so crazy. But I'm still growing, still out there. Got a big project coming up. You'll see the results of this project in a few weeks. I've been planning for this project for years now, and it's actually happening. And that's what I'm focusing on, is some of the build out within my garden, some of the structures, and just accepting that the plants will happen when they're ready. And I just have to have patience about it. Sunset Gazing says, I walk my yard and pluck flower heads before they go to seed. How do you tell a true dandelion from a look-alike? In some areas, dandelions have been eradicated. And so look at the flower. A dandelion does have a pretty unique flower structure. And so that's one of the best ways to do it. The leaves, the serrated leaves of a dandelion are also pretty specific. And so there are other low-lying plants that will give you yellow flowers that are similar, but their leaves are going to be totally different. So that's those two things. Look at the flower head along with the leaves and you should be able to identify it as a dandelion pretty easily. And if you are pretty certain that they've been eradicated in your area, and you see a plant that doesn't have the serrated, the big cutouts in the leaves, and it doesn't have that like dome-shaped yellow series, and if you look really close, you can see the little individual petals on the inside of the flower, then yeah, it probably is a lookalike. And so then you can figure out what that lookalike is and learn about plant identification in that respect. But dandelions are one of those things. Also, the stem that the flower grows on is relatively unique. There are some lookalikes that have much shorter flower stalks. And so lots of information out there, lots of pictures out there with dandelions, and you can get a really good, clear picture of what it should look like if it is a dandelion, and then everything else isn't. And that's how I do a lot of my plant identification, is I'll know what a plant should look like, and I may not know the types of all the other plants around it, but if they don't look like what I know it should look like, then I know that's not the plant that I'm looking for. And as you do more and more of the gardening and focusing on the varieties and the types of plants, and then remembering it, and go ahead and take pictures and put it in your journal and make the notes as you learn all those things, so you can revisit it as a reference source. That's really a good way to learn how to move forward. In the tour this weekend that I did, there was one bed in particular at one house, and had garlic. The garlic looked great. Right next to it was some onions, looked like yellow onions. And so I looked at the bed and immediately thought, wow, that garlic looks great. I could tell that there was some soft neck garlic, and I could tell that there was some hard neck garlic, because the hard neck garlic grows the scapes, those little curly cues that start to develop the flower head of that type of garlic. And I didn't even think anything about it. I just thought, wow, what wonderful looking garlic and onion plants. And as I was taking pictures of that bed, two different groups of people, two different couples walked by looking at that same bed, and both of those couples were like, I wonder what kind of plant that is. And it just goes to show that not everybody knows what a garlic plant looks like. Not everybody knows what an onion plant looks like. And so it's second nature for me, but there were many other plants I looked at that I had no clue what they were. And luckily, most of the gardens had the labels or a little sign underneath that tell what the unique plants were. But that's how you get better at identifying plants, is to take the time to grow it in your own garden and recognize the differences, so that when you go someplace else, it is second nature when you see some of the things. And then don't assume that all gardeners know the same plants and that all gardeners can identify what you have. You probably have plants in your garden that many other gardeners wouldn't be able to identify from sight. So get out there and learn those kind of things. And especially, like I talked about earlier at the beginning with tomato plants, when you recognize the different types of leaves that tomato plants have, and the different types of fruits, and the different growing types that between the bush and the vining, and then there are variants where you've got semi-determinate tomato plants growing. So there's no single answer for any plant we're growing in the garden. It's all up to each of us to have to learn and figure out what we're growing and what does best in our garden in particular. And I saw something yesterday and today. There are videos popping up on YouTube that, and then I got an email from one of the garden magazines this morning as well, saying, now's the time to start your fall garden. That was the email. Or a video might be, these are the plants you can grow in July. And I saw another one that's like, it's not too late to grow these plants. Well, I bring this topic up from time to time. I'm asking you to use caution anytime somebody tells you what your gardening calendar should look like. Anytime someone says to you, grow these plants in June. Start these plants in July. Put these plants into your garden right now. Because I thought, here I've got this gardening magazine telling me it's time to start my fall garden, and I don't even have my summer garden growing yet. And of course, the source of this gardening magazine is the East Coast of the United States. It's New England. Their conditions are completely different than mine. I visited Connecticut last month, and the growing conditions in Connecticut are incredible compared to the growing conditions in Colorado. So sure, for an area of that part of the United States, it might make sense to start thinking about putting in the plants that are going to be growing into fall, because conditions can change pretty quickly going into fall in New England as temperatures drop, and it affects your gardening. But it doesn't match what's happening to me in my Colorado garden. And so just be aware of that as you start seeing these videos and these articles and these kind of things that are starting to pop up, and they're telling you, you should be starting these plants. You should be doing this thing in your garden. Please take the time to stop and question it and see if it's really appropriate for your garden, if it really matches what's happening. And I do this. I try not to tell you what you should be growing, because I'm aware all of our gardens are different. But it slips out, and occasionally I'll give advice of starting plants at different times and things that I grow at different times. It's the same thing. Don't take what my suggestion is as something you should be doing. It's just a guideline. It's an example of what's working for me, and it might match you, but it might not. And so it distresses me a little bit when I see those kind of videos, because I know there's so many new gardeners out there that can't stop, and they don't know enough to ask the question. And then they take that advice and they put those plants in their garden, and they don't survive, or they do so bad that it puts a bad taste in that gardener's mouth, and they never garden again. So I think some of this information really can do damage, which is why I encourage you to question all the information you get, because it may not be appropriate. It's better for you to go to your next door neighbor and see what they're doing and copy them than to copy someone who's gardening 5,000 miles away from you and has no idea what your garden looks like, has completely different weather patterns, has completely different soil, and they're telling you what you should be growing. I just have a lot of trouble with that. So I wanted to share that with you today, because not much gets my ire up in the garden, but that's one of those things when I see someone telling me how I should be gardening in Colorado, and I know that it just won't work. When I was at the Galileo greenhouse and I had so many volunteers helping out with that big school garden, and many of them were coming from other states, and they were volunteering because they knew that they could come and Gardener Scott would teach them how to garden in Colorado. And I had, one was a California master gardener and one was a Kansas master gardener, and they got to Colorado and couldn't grow anything because the conditions were so different. And they were trying to grow the same way that they were growing in California and in Kansas. And it doesn't work. You've got to modify whatever you're doing to match your local environment. And so that's why I was talking earlier about making note of how plants are growing in your garden. Learn about the different varieties and then move forward so that you can make the best decisions about the tomatoes and the cucumbers and everything else that's growing in your garden. So be an informed gardener. And an informed gardener, as part of that education, ask questions. And don't always assume that the information you're getting is the best information. Andrea, thank you so much for that contribution. I do appreciate that. Thanks, Gardener Scott, as always, for your wealth of knowledge, fun, and comical discussion today. full of plant jokes. That's great. I'll have to review it. I haven't been able to stay up with all of that, so I'll have to see what the plant jokes are. So that's fantastic. Robin's Container Garden, nice to have you here from across the pond. I gardened in Arkansas for years, then had to relearn everything when I moved to Scotland. There you go. Exactly. Check out Robin's Container Garden channel on YouTube, because it's interesting to see a Scottish gardener doing YouTube videos without a Scottish accent. So check out Robin, and you'll be in for a treat, and see how she's growing in Scotland and relearning some of the things about how you grow plants, which is an important factor, because we all want that success, and we often want to grow that plant that grew well for us someplace else. And the answer might be you can't. Not everything grows in the same place or in the same way that you're doing it in a different place. So, hey, guess what? I'm going to be back Monday next week, and we get to do this all over again. I hope you have a great gardening week. I'm headed outside now to put some more water on my seed beds, because the sun has probably already dried them out over the course of a couple hours. And keep your fingers crossed that my cucumbers, and those of you that are also waiting for the cucumbers to germinate, that we actually have plants by the end of the week. Always nice to have you here. Thanks so much for your support, and as always, enjoy gardening.